two, one.
Hey you guys, so today we had a snow day. It's really kind of sad. Like, look how sad. It's April. That's not fair. So me and Bella's right over here. Bella! She wants me to leave her alone. Leave her alone, play with her, or pet her, but not pester her. So anyway, I thought I would redo my World War II video because my last one was kind of boring. So I'm gonna do my best to keep you entertained because World War II is always students' favorite topic. So let's get right into it. So we hopefully remember that the United States, and not just the United States, but worldwide, there had been a depression in the 20s. And it was very severe. There's a lot of different reasons for it. And the reason that the Great Depression hit the United States was slightly different than the reasons that it hit Europe. But we're going to kind of focus on Europe in this talk because the United States did play a large role in World War II, but I think it's really important to understand kind of what was going on in Europe to fully understand why the war happened, like the dynamics of the war and all that kind of stuff. So first of all, what we see, okay, you guys, so I hope you have this in your mind. When you have a government becoming really unstable, or just pretty much anything, anytime people feel unsafe, they are willing to have their personal freedoms limited a lot more than they would otherwise. It's kind of a strange thing that we do. Like, we just want safety. And so when that comes to a government, they tend to be really attracted to strong leaders. And I think that's what we see right before World War II starts, because you guys remember that World War I had happened like around 20 years before that, a little bit more, and there had been a worldwide depression. People didn't see it coming. And so what we see is the rise of fascist governments in a few places in the world. So we need to define fascism first. So you guys will see on this picture, there's a few fascist dictators that that you need to kind of recognize. But fascism is extreme authoritarian governments that are motivated by feelings of intense nationalism. So that means, like, nationalism means pride in your country, okay? And devotion to your country. And authoritarian means that the government has all authority in people's lives and will do anything to get it. So people give over extreme authority to their government when they believe that their country is like better than everybody else. So there's the rise of these fascist governments. So let's just kind of go through real quick. We have Hitler here up on the right, and he is going to be the fascist dictator of Germany. Oh, give me just a second. I gotta pause. Sorry about that. In the middle here, we have Benito Mussolini of Italy. Oh, I'm sorry. That's Joseph Stalin of the USSR, the United Soviet State of Russia, or also known as Russia now. We've got Benito Mussolini here from Italy. This is Emperor Hirohito from Japan. I think that's Hirohito. And then this is Francisco Franco from Spain. All of them were fascist dictators that took power during that time, like in between the 20s and 30s, right before World War II. So when we talk about fascism, what is it that people kind of believe when they have a fascist government? So first of all, they believe that the primacy of the group, the primacy, I think that's how you pronounce it, of the group. It means that you feel that the group is more important than individuals. And so people give up their personal rights because they believe it's better for the country. Believing that one group is a victim. So this justifies any behavior against the group's enemies. It's kind of a weird thing. In Germany, I think German people started to see themselves as victims, and like because of the rest of Europe and how they had been treated in the Treaty of Versailles, I think they kind of saw themselves as victims, and they also saw themselves as victims, I think, concerning the Jews, because the Jews were still kind of wealthy and most Germans were not. The belief that individualism and liberalism enable dangerous decadence and have a negative effect on the group. So the idea that if you are looking out for your own good, that's kind of selfish. That's what number 3 means. A strong sense of community or brotherhood, and that this brother's unity and purity are created by common conviction or, if possible, by exclusionary violence if necessary. It means that in order to have unity together, that you need to have the same beliefs, okay? And that if anyone doesn't have the same beliefs as you, it's okay for you to use violence against them. Number 5, individual self-esteem is tied up in the grandeur of the group. So I'm going to feel good about myself if I'm part of a country or a group that is great. This Paxton refers to this as an enhanced sense of identity and belonging. Extreme support of a national leader or a natural leader who's always male. This results in one man taking on the role of a national savior. And I think we can really see that strongly with Hitler and how he took over Germany. The beauty of violence and of will when they are devoted to the group's success in a Darwinian struggle. The idea of naturally superior group, or especially in Hitler's case, biological racism, fits into a fascist interpretation of Darwinism. Darwinism is like this idea that only like the strong should survive, because the goal would be to make a species or a group better by getting rid of all weakness. So this kind of like justifies using violence against anyone who's like an outsider, anyone who is bringing the group down through weakness. So those are some of the things that kind of paved the way for fascism. Political unrest. So this is kind of the background to World War II and to the fascist dictators. Political unrest and fear of communist revolutions, like the one by Vladimir Lenin in 1917. So not just the United States, but also in other parts of Europe, people were afraid of communism coming to their countries. Triggered the rise of Benito Mussolini and the founding of the Fascist Party in Italy, and the rise of Adolf Hitler and the founding of the Nazi Party in Germany. At the same time, extreme militarists in Japan exerted more control in the 1930s and launched aggressive campaigns in the Pacific and East Asia. So there's some things that fascist dictators kind of have in common. You guys, by the way, if you don't have a clue what I'm talking about right now, it's okay. We're going to get there. I just kind of wanted to explain to you sort of the background of fascism and the way people were thinking, especially in Germany, because I think that's what people really struggle with, is like, how could such terrible things happen in Germany? And like, I think we have a hard time wrapping our head around that. And we kind of, oh, my battery's running low. We kind of want to imagine that that's like impossible, like that we could never be like that. And the truth is that that's just not true. Like, there's things that can happen in our lives and in our countries and our groups that would make us lean toward allowing those kinds of things to happen. Okay, give me just a second. I need to go plug my computer in. Okay, I'm back. So fascist dictators have some certain things in common. They tend to be very charismatic. Charismatic is like where you are a good speaker, you're very passionate, and people want to listen to you. They want to control the economy. Censorship, so they want to control what people are saying and what the newspapers publish, things like that. Policies of racism, especially because like fascism is all about extreme like nationalism and patriotism. So anything that deviates from that, like any person, any group that is not the same as yours, that would be considered like an outsider. And so they have to make them the villain. The importance of the military, of course, because they're often also totalitarian. Bella just ate a snack. She likes it. Oops. Okay, so let's just quickly go over Europe after World War One, and I think that's going to help us sort of lead into World War Two. So after World War One, millions of lives were lost. France, Germany, Great Britain alone accounted for more than 4 million soldiers dead and 10 million wounded. This doesn't include how many civilians died or the 15 million refugees that were trying to leave those countries. Destruction of millions of dollars worth of property. Some major empires where they had kings and queens and things collapsed. So the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, the German, the Ottoman empires collapsed. Most of them were replaced with national republic governments. After the fall of the empires, new nations were formed. There was no tradition of democratic governments in these nations, so democracy was new. There was political instability in older, more established nations like France and Great Britain. The government in France changed 40 times in 20 years after World War One, and the continent was virtually bankrupt. Most European countries thought the possibility of another war, they thought that was horrifying. And it was a major reason that they adopted what we call a policy of appeasement because they wanted to avoid war at any cost. So what that means is they kind of thought that if they just gave Hitler what he wanted, like Hitler starts breaking the Treaty of Versailles, which we're going to start talking about that, and they thought, like, if we just give him a little bit and give him what he wants a little bit, that he'll be happy with that and he'll quit. That was not true. That didn't happen. So, how did Hitler come to power in Germany? He decided that strong leadership was required to save Germany and recover from the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles. In 1921, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, also known as the Nazi Party, chose Hitler as their party leader, and he copied what Benito Mussolini and the Fascist Party of Italy was doing. He actually was in prison for a while, and while he was in prison, he wrote a book called Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle, and it was published in 1925, and it talked about kind of his views on Germany and what it meant to be strong and how the country should run and his views on socialism. In 1933, the Nazis took over power and became the only legal political party in Germany. So they started silencing all opposition. Hitler appointed himself Führer in 1934, and he began to remove all political opposition. So what you're going to see in the coming slides is kind of how he became more and more aggressive and how other countries wanting to avoid war just kind of avoided the conflict, and they really didn't get involved. So I love showing this picture. On the left, I think it's on your left, you see these kids playing with stacks of, this is money. They look like blocks, but this is money. This shows that in Germany, in the 20s, the money, like because of the Great Depression, because of the collapse of their economy, their money became so inflated, so devalued that it became almost worthless. So it was worth so little, parents started giving it to their kids to play with because it was just, you couldn't do anything with it. People used to take wheelbarrows full of money to the store to buy like a loaf of bread because it was worth so little. And as this was happening, like I said, when it comes to fascism, often you want to find a group to blame. Like you need to see yourselves as a victim in order for fascism to work. And so they start kind of formulating this picture of outside European countries picking on them and like mistreating them and humiliating them. And also they start to point at the Jews. So right here, you can see a piece of propaganda that was published. It was actually a film about the Jews in the world. I had a German student one time that translated this for me. It means the eternal Jew. And if you look at the picture, you can see that the way that this person was drawn is supposed to make you think some things. Like, first of all, you see the face that looks like yellow and unnatural. The eyebrows and the nose and it makes it look like really evil, really inhuman. It kind of resembles in some ways an ape if you were to compare like an ape to this. And that's one thing when it comes to like genocide and villainizing another group, you almost always have to dehumanize. No, you always have to dehumanize the other group. You have to see them as animals or disease or a problem that is not the same as you because people don't attack others that are the same as them. It's like kind of a weird thing that we do. So now that I've kind of told you the history behind, like the idea behind totalitarianism and fascism, let's talk about like how it manifested around the world. So fascist totalitarian governments popped up around the world, and a lot of them were connected to political and economic instability. One example of this would be Latin America. So when we say Latin America, we're talking about South America. Um, so up until this point, we had a lot of political influence in Latin America, and part of that was that we said we would get involved in Cuba if something seemed to go wrong or if the government destabilized. FDR really did not want to he didn't want to use military force if possible. Instead, he adopted something called the Good Neighbor Policy to replace the Platt Amendment. And he just said that we should use economic influence instead of military force in Latin America and try to promote trade and cultural exchanges instead of getting them to do what we want by using threat of force. So if you guys remember from earlier in the year, that would be the difference between soft power and hard power. Soft power is where you try to use like a positive influence, and hard power would be the threat of violence or force. An ideal situation would be sort of like a combination of both. He canceled the Platt Amendment, which was what we had said that it was our promise to get involved if something went wrong in Cuba. So we said we're not going to do that anymore. We also removed our troops from Haiti. And as soon as the United States kind of left Latin America, this gave rise to dictators who take control in Cuba, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. Mexico also started moving toward a more socialist type of government, socialist communist, when they nationalized the oil industry. And before this, the oil industry had been, I believe, mostly controlled and owned by American businessmen. So they basically took away the property of American businessmen, and FDR had already said we're not going to get involved in Latin America. So it was kind of a bold move, they're like kind of testing that. But they did later agree to pay the oil companies for their property, even though they had taken them by force. So in Europe and Asia, we also have the rise of totalitarianism. You can kind of think of the word total, like total means like complete control, which totalitarianism is a political system where the government controls every aspect of citizens' lives, and they'll do it using whatever means necessary. In Italy, I've already mentioned to you that Benito Mussolini, he actually used to be a journalist and he was a soldier as well. And he ended up taking over the Italian government with his followers. They were called black shirts. This was actually after Italy had sort of started to destabilize. There had been the Depression in Italy. They were upset that after World War I, even though they were on the winning side, they didn't gain very much land, which was the original intent of even fighting in the war. They were hoping that they would win some land in the war, which they didn't get. So they established a fascist totalitarian government. Fascism, like I said, means a single person leads the government, which is seen as more important than the individuals. In October of 1935, Italy conquered the African nation of Ethiopia, which, by the way, was like the only country in Africa who had never been conquered by a European power. And to this day, actually, Ethiopia brags about that. Um, so the part that Italy actually was able to take over, I almost got a job there. That was the funny thing. I was offered a job there, but it was a small corner. It sort of split Ethiopia in half. It's called Eritrea now, and that was controlled by the Italians. Germany had been stuck paying World War I reparations, like the money to kind of pay for the war. And the Depression had ruined their economy. I already showed you that picture of the kids playing with the money. And this gives rise to Adolf Hitler, who was a World War I vet and politician who gained a following because of people's desperation for a strong, confident leader. He was very charismatic. And he blamed Germany's problems on communists, Jews, and intellectuals. So remember, in a fascist government, you need to make yourselves the victim and you need to create an enemy. So these are the three that were kind of the enemies. And it's going to evolve later to be like a more inclusive group that was the enemy. So it could be anyone who was like really religious or anyone who was really different or anyone who was weak. And he creates the Nazis, which was, well, he doesn't create them. He becomes the head of the Nationalist Social Party, and he was elected to power in 1932. He becomes the German Chancellor in 1933 and then became a dictator. So during the Nazi rule, they first began violating the Treaty of Versailles by rebuilding their army and taking over territory. At the time, like all European countries and the United States, they were adopting something called a policy of non-aggression, where they or appeasement, where they would try to give Hitler just like what he wanted. So when he started taking over little pieces of land, they kind of left it alone, hoping that he would just get what he wanted and stop. The Axis powers was also created, where Italy and Germany made a military alliance. The Nazis began to target Jews first by declaring them not citizens of Germany, so it kind of others them, and taking their property. And then like total violence breaks out on November 9th of 1938 in a night called Kristallnacht. It means Night of the Broken Glass, where Nazis started attacking and destroying Jewish businesses and synagogues in Germany and Austria. So that was kind of where like people saw this like growing anger toward Jews and like kind of where they were starting to be targeted, but Kristallnacht is when they actually physically took action on that. Japan also became a bit more aggressive. They invaded northern China called Manchuria in 1931. Manchuria actually is like now in China. Manchuria is where the majority of the factories and like mining is. So it's a very wealthy part of China. They also began to build up their navy, even though they had pledged in the Washington Conference. I don't know if you guys remember that, that they would reduce the size of their navies. Do you guys remember that in the 20s, the United States held that Washington Conference, and that was one of the agreements that countries worldwide would reduce their navies because they thought that reducing weapons would lead to world peace. So when Japan violates this, that's a big deal. It's threatening the world. When one group starts to arm themselves and everybody else is not armed, that scares people. So that's going to trigger a lot of like nervousness. And they controlled most of China by 1937. So they were very, very aggressive. And by the way that the Japanese treated Chinese during that time is like horrific. And you can look up some things that we probably won't get into, but if you look at like the rape of Nanjing, you'll see that it was terrible. Like Japanese atrocities were outrageous. So although the United States condemned Japan's actions, most Americans didn't want to use force against Japan. Roosevelt wanted to stop aggression without going to war. And remember, the United States had always been traditionally isolationist, meaning like we wanted to keep to ourselves. And especially after World War One, when World War One was so terrible, even though we only went in at the very end, Americans just didn't want to get involved in other people's problems that might threaten them personally and their family, and they just didn't see the point of it. So the Congress passed 4 neutrality acts to keep the United States out of international conflicts. So some of the things that included were like they weren't allowed to give out loans to countries at war. I think they weren't allowed to sell weapons. Um, I don't remember all of them, but yeah. So as the totalitarian states grew more aggressive, some Americans started wanting the United States to act, but up until this point, people will generally refuse. So this next section is going to be about how World War II began. Excuse me, my throat is having a rough time, so I got some tea. Let's get started on this. Okay, so Hitler had been wanting revenge for World War I for a long time, especially because of the Treaty of Versailles, and he felt that it had unfairly punished Germany for the war. So 2 years later, Hitler forced Austria to unite with Germany. Because remember that Hitler, or I don't know if you know this, but Hitler wasn't actually German. Hitler was Austrian. And Austria and Germany had always been kind of close allies. They were physically close to each other. That was one reason. But also they had a lot of similarities when it came to religion and politics. Like their families kind of intermarried together for a long time. So it wasn't that far of a stretch for them to be united. But a lot of countries at the time were so concerned about all of their money problems that they really just didn't pay attention to what Hitler was doing, and they just couldn't worry about it. So Hitler started becoming more aggressive, and one of the first things he did was in 1938, he asked for Czechoslovakia to give over an area of land called the Sudetenland, which had many, like a lot of people who were actually German heritage, but Czechoslovakia refused. And so actually, eventually, he just invaded it. He just took over it. So in 1938, there was something called the Munich Conference. And France and Britain actually gave the Sudetenland to Germany. I believe Germany had already taken it, but then they said, no, that's fine, that's yours, because they were trying to keep him happy by using appeasement. And Winston Churchill, who was like a representative from Great Britain, he said that, and he was later the, what is it called? The Prime Minister of Great Britain. He thought that this policy of appeasement was just giving too much to Hitler, that it wasn't okay to just give him what he wanted to keep the peace. So Hitler starts demanding more after this. So then he demanded that Poland give him the city of Danzig. And let's see, where are we going here? That was where it was starting to get too far. Great Britain and France then pledged that they would defend Poland in case of anything that would happen. In 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union made a secret promise to each other called the Non-Aggression Act, where they promised that they would be allies. Basically, they wouldn't attack each other, and they wanted to each divide and invade Poland. So World War II officially began when Germany invaded Poland in September 1st of 1939. As soon as that happened, Great Britain and France, who were called the Allied Powers, declared war on Germany. But the problem was that Germany, like these countries were really not like quite so prepared for war like Germany was. Like Germany had been building up their army, had been planning all of this stuff, and actually had been developing weapons and strategies for a long time because they had already been planning this. So it was rough, right? So when Hitler he used this style of fighting called Blitzkrieg, which literally means lightning war, where he like the strategy was to attack and overwhelm the enemy by using like all of his force all at once, to quickly break through their lines and take over land. So if you guys remember, Bella's acting really crazy over here. See if you can see her. Bella, are you losing it? She's looking for her bone. Okay, I have to pause this because I won't be able to concentrate with her doing this. That was entertaining. Where was I? Hitler used Blitzkrieg. Oh, so he moved really quickly. So in World War I, one of the problems was that there was like a stalemate because of the style of fighting, where the two sides were just like so equally matched that nobody moved anywhere. So in World War I, it caused like so much death, so much trauma because they had to work so hard just to move a little bit. But Hitler moved extremely fast because of this style of fighting that he was using. So one of the first things he did was he invaded France and he moved very, very quickly. And part of the problem, I don't know if you can see this, but France was expecting Germany to attack them. So they gathered their forces along this like red dotted line, if you can see it right down here. It's called the Maginot Line. So they expected to meet Germany head on. So knowing this, Germany actually bypassed that line and invaded Belgium and got through Belgium super quickly because they were using Blitzkrieg, and they were able to take over Paris by June 22nd of 1940. That's extremely fast. And that is going to force, I think it's off my map, but it forces like all of the French to basically flee, or all the French soldiers, the French army to flee France and to try to escape to Great Britain. So by 1940, I mean, that was a really, really short time. What was that, like 1 year? Not even a year. Germany already controlled like pretty much all of their enemies. And so Hitler wanted to quickly defeat Great Britain as well. So he just like went crazy attacking Great Britain for 2 months in the Battle of Britain. He just like bombed the crap out of England. But the problem was that in order for like Blitzkrieg to work, he had to use all of his forces. So the problem with Great Britain is, if you guys can see, this is France and this is Great Britain. This is England. You guys know that England and Great Britain are kind of the same thing. He couldn't use his tanks. He couldn't use all of his ground forces. So all he had was the submarines, and he had his navy, and he had airplanes. So that eliminated a lot of his strength because he needed all that stuff. So that's where Winston Churchill's famous saying is. He says, "We will fight on the," oh my gosh, I'm going to butcher it now. "We're going to fight on the beaches. We're going to fight on the street. Like, we're never going to surrender," basically. Oh my gosh, that was a terrible summary of that. But he says that Great Britain will never surrender. And so the British won that simply by like surviving it, basically. So when Hitler saw that the British were actually slightly stronger than he expected, he canceled his plans to do a land invasion of Great Britain because he was afraid he would lose. So you can see this a little bit closer here. This is what I was talking about. Oh my gosh. The Maginot Line. So this is between Germany and France. This is where they expected to hit each other. Oh my gosh. But instead Germany invaded through Belgium and went around. all these blue lines or these blue dots here are attacks from the Battle of Britain. You can see that Germany did their best to try to get through the forces, and they just like never quite make it. Through all of this, the United States is resisting. Like the American public, once again, didn't support, for the most part, didn't support joining another war. We knew that we had gotten pulled into World War I by giving loans to people at war, stuff like that. So in 1939, we were starting to get concerned because we didn't want to see Germany take over all of Europe. So we approved something called cash and carry, which allows the Allies to pay cash for weapons and carry them to Europe in their own ships. So if you guys remember from World War I, part of the reason we ended up entering the war is because the Lusitania, which was carrying a bunch of weapons and supplies from our country that were being sold to Great Britain and France, it was sunk. And so we didn't want to see ourselves get into another situation like that. But honestly, this was a great opportunity for us to make money. So it's going to be hard to say that or to stop or to not do that. Our next step toward kind of picking a side and going to war is when Roosevelt gave 50 U.S. destroyers to Great Britain in exchange for future naval bases in the Caribbean. So this is kind of like a pay it, wait, is that right word? Pay it forward? I don't know if that's not quite right, but yeah, so we actually did kind of side with Britain, but we just didn't want to get involved yet. So in 1940, we had another presidential election. FDR did something that is not usually accepted in American government, and he ran for a third term. Usually it's kind of tradition that American presidents don't do that. He beat out the opposition, who was Republican Wendell Willkie, because I think Americans just trusted him. He had seen them through the Great Depression. They, there's an old saying, better the devil you know than the devil you don't know. So they supported FDR. In 1941, we approved the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed the president to loan weapons and supplies to Great Britain and later to the Soviet Union. Okay, by the way, the reason that I say Soviet Union, if you guys remember, Germany and the Soviet Union were allies. Like they were fighting together against us, against Great Britain and France. But the problem is that Hitler is going to end up getting too antsy and he betrays Stalin and he actually attacks Russia. And that's going to tick Russia off. So then Russia becomes allies. They switch sides. In the Battle of the Atlantic, this is what's going to be one of the things that starts pushing us closer to war. The German ships attack Allied shipping, which led the U.S. Navy to start escorting convoys as far as Iceland, because once again, we were selling stuff to the Allies and we wanted to make sure that our stuff actually got to them. In 1941, we also move a step closer to officially declaring sides. We passed something called the Atlantic Charter. Now, you gotta pay attention to this because otherwise it won't make sense. So all it was us agreeing with Great Britain that in the future we were going to work together for peace when the war was over. But really what that was doing is it was saying hey, we're on your side. So again, we weren't officially involved in the war because Americans didn't support that, but we are starting to take sides. Japan joined the Axis power in 1940. Seriously, Japan's reason for getting involved, picking a side was that they just wanted a reason to invade other countries. And this gave them that reason. So they joined the Axis powers in 1940 and they took over French Indochina in 1941. So this is how we actually get involved in the war. The United States froze Japanese funds and blocked oil sales to Japan when they started invading other countries. And the real kicker is when Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. forces at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And this is going to cause us to declare war on Japan and Germany, who is an ally of Japan, and then they're going to declare war on us. I just wanted to show you this to show you why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Okay, so right over here is Pearl Harbor. All of these like orangish yellow places were areas that Japan had taken over. Here's actual Japan, okay? But everything yellow they had taken over. So at the time, the only country that was a real threat to them was us because of our naval base at Pearl Harbor. It gave us quick access using our Navy to all of the Pacific. And they thought that if we ever decided, and you guys know, we were already starting to lean toward the side of the Allies. If we ever decided to actually oppose them, our Navy was pretty much the only thing that threatened their power of the entire Pacific Ocean. So they thought that if they bombed us at Pearl Harbor, that they would completely destroy our Navy and it would make it so we couldn't even enter the war. This didn't work. So this is what actually brought the United States into the war. So now we were officially at war. You know, I just realized I don't think I mentioned when Pearl Harbor was bombed. It was December 7th of 1941. So that can help you kind of like place when we got involved. So once we were officially at war, we had to mobilize. Mobilize means to move, get ready to move. So in 1940, interestingly enough, they passed something called the Selective Training and Service Act that required men ages 21 to 35, and later they changed it to 18 to 45 to register for the draft. So you can kind of put that together that we were expecting to go to war. Even though we officially weren't, we probably were expecting. So around 15 million Americans served in the Army, including 1 million African Americans and about 300,000 Mexican Americans. You know, I've been researching this as well. There was a lot of Native Americans that served in the wars. I think it was like 1.5 million, if I remember correctly. So they were in there too. And at the time, our economy was actually still depressed. We were still in the Great Depression. But as soon as we started mobilizing for the war and making all the stuff that we needed for war, it completely pulled us out of the depression because it gave everybody a job. It gave us a reason to spend money. So it ended the Great Depression. So there's a number of other things that our government had to do to get ready for war. We created the War Production Board that helped to convert factories from like normal things like tin cans or whatever to making weapons and things like that. The government organized scrap drives for things like rubber and metal so they could use it to make usually weapons. People had to buy ration coupons, so if you wanted to buy coffee or gas, you'd have to use one of your coupons. So you weren't allowed to buy as much coffee as you wanted to or whatever. You had to only buy as much as you were allowed to buy. They also created the Office of War Information, which literally their job was to create propaganda to make sure that people supported the war. And then in order to pay for the war, the government increased income taxes and sold war bonds. And a lot of people bought those war bonds. It's like really similar to a savings bond. Women played a large role in World War II, like even more, I think, than World War I. They took a lot of jobs in factories and offices, but usually they still were receiving lower wages than men. So you guys probably think of Rosie the Riveter, the lady who's like flexing and she says, "We can do it." She was World War II propaganda, and she was published to encourage people to get or encourage women to get involved in the war, and just to go to work in general. About 300,000 women served in the army, they did things like flew as pilots, and they also were nurses in combat areas. So they were more involved than they were in World War One. African Americans, this should sound familiar. They migrate even more to the north to find jobs in factories. They were still experiencing a lot of discrimination, like lower wages than white workers. And this time, people were starting to protest a lot more than in the past. So, one of the big protests was led by Philip Randolph. He was an African American leader who planned to march on Washington, like a huge march on Washington, to protest against discrimination of African Americans. And actually, he ended up canceling his march because FDR created something called the Fair Employment Practices Commission to make sure that discrimination was not happening in war industries and government jobs. So he was still, I mean, he didn't have control over private businesses in the South, but he did say, no, the government is not going to discriminate against African Americans or anyone else. For Mexican Americans, there was a group called Braceros that were actually, I think there was like 200,000 of them that were actually asked to come across the border from Mexico to start working in the United States because we were so short on workers to work in our agricultural fields in the American Southwest. But there was a lot of like discrimination against them. Something called the Zoot Suit riots in 1943. Zoot suits are like these like it was like a suit, like kind of the way that the Mexican Americans would dress. It was their style. There's a picture of a zoot suit, usually like really baggy pants, a longer jacket, really, really big hats usually went with zoot suits. So in 1943, a group of US sailors attacked Mexican Americans wearing zoot suits. So it was like we needed them, but there was still a lot of, animosity against them. Okay, so I hope you're hearing that the last few things I've been talking about, we're talking about racism in America during the war, because I think a lot of times when we're talking about World War II, people focus on the racism in Germany, but we don't talk about how racist the United States was. And I think this last one would be probably like the most, like, the thing that we don't know as much about, but it's really crazy that we had this. So there was a lot of Japanese Americans living in the United States, but during the war, especially after Pearl Harbor, a lot of people hated the Japanese. They called them names, all kinds of stuff. And so in 1941, the United States government passed an executive order and rounded up 125,000 Japanese people and put them into internment camps. So not concentration camps. We weren't like gassing anyone. We weren't killing anyone. But they were imprisoned because the government was afraid that they would be more loyal to the Japanese government than to us. And so there were two groups that were imprisoned, the Issei and the Nisei. The Issei were immigrants who were born in Japan but came to the United States after they had been born, and the Nisei were people born in the United States, and both um, both were imprisoned. In fact, I think if you guys have heard of, his name is George Takei. He's in Star Trek. He was one of the Japanese people imprisoned in the camps during World War II. But a lot of those Japanese Americans wanted to prove their loyalty to the United States, and they volunteered for military service, and they fought against their countrymen, or against the other Japanese.